The first Libya peace conference has wrapped up in Berlin, yielding an agreement that's hoped will pave the way for a lasting ceasefire in the country and ultimately an end to years of bloodshed and the country's civil war. We're joined live now by RT's correspondent Peter Oliver, who's currently in Berlin for us. Peter, what does this all mean for Libya?
Hello. Well, German Chancellor Angela Merkel seemed reasonably confident that progress had been made as she wrapped up this conference on Libya here in the German capital. She did acknowledge, though, that neither Fayez al-Sarraj or Khalifa Haftar, heading up both of the opposing sides in the Libyan conflict, took part in face-to-face talks. That had been expected or really hoped for heading into this summit. That didn't happen. The UN Secretary-General, though, Guterres, he did say that what was of most and utmost importance at the moment was making sure that there was a functional ceasefire on the ground in the country.
First, we need to have a ceasefire. We cannot monitor something that doesn't exist. So we need to have a ceasefire. We have a truce. And one central question is that all the participants today committed to support the ceasefire and committed to put pressure on the parties to the conflict for a full ceasefire to be reached.
Also speaking at that press conference, the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas was measured in his confidence following the talks. He said that these discussions had led to a key that could be used and should be used to unlock the situation on the ground.
We have achieved the objectives that we set for this conference. We now have the key in our hands to solve the conflict. Now what we have to do is use this key, put it in the lock and open the door.
From the Russian side, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, spoke to journalists and said that while the talks had been positive, he also acknowledged that there were still major differences between the two sides in Libya.
Generally, we think the conference was useful. It's clear that the final decision is up to the Libyans. It's also clear that, so far, stable dialogue between the warring parties is unreachable. The differences of approach are too great. But still, the suggestions the final document contains contribute to creating appropriate conditions for both sides to sit and talk.
Well, the takeaway from this summit in Berlin is that, well, there will be more summits, there will be more talks. The UN Secretary-General said that he'll be meeting with representatives of both sides in Geneva this coming week, while it was confirmed by the German Foreign Minister that there would be talks by EU ministers in Brussels on Monday.
Well, here's Peter Oliver. Thank you for that. Let's discuss this further now and go to Marc Almond, the director of the Crisis Research Institute. Thank you for joining us on the programme. What's your assessment of how these talks went? Does this proposed ceasefire mechanism amount to much, in your opinion?
Well, I think the real danger is that the main virtue of these talks has been that the external actors have been able to agree, but as we've heard, the two main rivals couldn't speak face to face, let alone agree. And secondly, there are perhaps 30 different subgroups fighting on the ground, so that it may be that there's going to be a ceasefire that holds. It could possibly be in the interests of both sides, but getting their various cohorts to obey orders has not been easy so far. And there is the danger that each side will be looking to manoeuvre for getting international credibility and kudos by saying, we're trying to keep the ceasefire, but the others are breaking it. And so there's always the danger that what particularly the Tripoli government might want is more foreign intervention to back it up, and therefore in some ways having Haftar be seen or actually doing something breaking the ceasefire is good for them. Equally, Haftar and some of his backers like Egypt and the UAE may say we're very close to victory, maybe one last push and we can win, and therefore people will accept facts on the ground. The problem is that creating those facts on the ground is proving very difficult for both sides, and equally the Europeans, the Russians, the UN have limited pull over the players. That's the big problem. It's not as though there's a patron in the background who's really giving orders.
Yeah, this document, it contains only suggestions, as you said. Might the UN Security Council throw its weight behind with a resolution?
Well, it might, but of course, as people point out, there have been a UN resolution forbidding people from supplying arms. There's supposed to be an arms embargo authorised by the UN Security Council, but as we can see, it has been ignored by quite a number of countries. So the risk is a new resolution will turn out to be empty. And one of the problems, as I say, I think we're finding is that the Libyans themselves are mercurial and awkward. They're not necessarily people who, even those countries that are close to the different sides, are able to trust or certainly to give orders to.
What are the main residual sticking points here?
Well, one is where, in fact, should the ceasefire line be? Because, for instance, for Haftar, one of his problems is that some of the people who've recently changed sides fear that if a ceasefire line is drawn, putting them back under the control of Tripoli, they will be penalised for having betrayed, as it were, Tripoli recently. On the other hand, equally, Tripoli says unless it can have a clear defensible perimeter, then what's the point of a ceasefire that could be ripped up overnight, as it were? So there is a problem of practices on the ground. Who's going to obey orders? Where is the line to be drawn? I think that is really going to be the devil in the detail, particularly if you don't have a powerful peacekeeping force. I don't see anybody wanting to send troops to Libya, wanting to put their soldiers in blue helmets and at risk of being shot at on the ground. So the danger is that you're relying upon two sides who don't trust each other at all to regulate their ceasefire in practice, because there isn't an enforcement mechanism. There may be a few observers, but they won't really be able to lay down the law.
On Sunday, Libya's largest oil field began shutting down after forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar closed a pipeline connecting it to the coast. Now, with Haftar apparently on the front foot, why would he agree to a truce? I think that is really the issue. Particularly, it's not only Haftar being on the front foot, but also some of his allies like Egypt. If we look at the Egyptian media, they're very hostile to anything short of victory over the people they regard as a threat to Egypt as much as to Haftar. So there is that danger that there's a real pressure for him to try to win at last. Equally, if the oil revenue is cut off, one of the few cards that Tripoli has is that the revenue passes through the central bank in Tripoli. If there isn't oil being exported, then its resources are going to shut down very quickly. Will it be able then to pay its own troops, to pay its own militias and so on? So there is a pressure on it from this, as it were, local oil embargo that Haftar is able to impose. Director of the Crisis Research Institute, Marc Almond, thank you for your time.